Okay, hello and welcome back to the channel. This is going to be one of those continuations of a series that I've already done, where I'm just going through, picking a random part of Blender, something that I use really commonly, and as I work through that feature, based on my experience with it, we just uncover more and more things about it to try and explain to you how it's used, how it's useful. So these kind of videos take as long as they take. I'm just going to be going through and we're going to take each aspect of this step by step. I'm going to put the links below on the timeline so that you can click through to the different parts that interest you. But I would advise watching the whole video because there's a ton of really useful aspects of this tool. And while I am explaining this tool, which is the 3D cursor, I'm going to be referring to it in a way that it's going to be for people that are coming from different softwares a lot, because I feel like they're the people that fundamentally don't understand this as much as people that are coming fresh into Blender and they've got that interest. And obviously, if you don't know what anything is in Blender because you're new to 3D applications in general, this is still going to be really useful, but you're going to understand it a little bit easier than some people that have been using it for a long time, because some features like this, if you use multiple softwares, you can miss little features here and there, or you can see something and be like, oh, I don't know the point of that. So I'm just trying to look to clear some of that up. So the 3D cursor itself is this little thing in the middle of the screen, and by default, as I've opened Blender right now, what we've got is the selection tool, select box. So when I left click here, the select box is going to start appearing, and we all know what a select box does, hopefully. If you don't, actually, I've got a video on that, which is part of the series for selection methods. But just right below that, we've actually got the 3D cursor setting here. And if you're unaware of how Blender UI works, every tool that I'm on generally will have a toolbox setting at the top right here. And you can start to see there's quite a few settings related to this 3D cursor, and actually that appears all the time over on the tool settings over here, as well as potentially somewhere else down there, but I've got a lot of add-ons on at the minute. So the tool settings also appear over here, and we can start, we can bring that out a little bit more if we want to, and we can start looking at what we want to do with this object, this thing, this little cursor down here. So when I'm actually selected on the thing, instead of dragging a box like the select tool does, it starts moving that cursor around in screen space. So what we can see is actually, if I'm just clicking at random, the orientation of this cursor is set to view. And we can see that actually, if I start to move around here, we can see that, well, that tracks, because we can see little black lines coming off this that indicate the axis of orientation, just like this at the top right here, this thing that shows you X, Y, Z. The cursor has that exact same structure to it, so that's worth mentioning as well. If you're not understanding me so far, some stuff will become more clear when we start doing practical example with this stuff. So when I click around, we can see that it's moving it in 3D space, but it's not when it's aligned to well, not that setting there, but when we're clicking around here, it's doing it as if the screen is 2D and we're actually working in 3D space, obviously. So the way we can start controlling this and moving it around in a way that's a little bit more predictable is it actually takes advantage of all of the snapping settings that you can use here. I've got other videos on snapping settings as well. But let's go for just pressing Shift S at the minute, which again is part of the snapping settings control here. And we can see that actually a good, if there's 9 settings here, at least 6 or 7 of them are dedicated to just the cursor. And then it's really just the grid one here and the active one here that aren't related to the cursor. And what we've got there is, have a good read through them yourself. But what we've got here is either moving the cursor around on the bottom 4 here, or moving the object to the cursor at these top ones. So the snapping settings there are really based all around this 3D cursor concept, which for the most part, it's just an empty object that is permanent in the Blender scene, but it's temporary. So if I snap this back to the world origin, we go to our snap settings and we just turn them on like that. We can see that it's set to increment. Then I can actually move this cursor, and accidentally I've clicked and moved it in the wrong space. So by just clicking randomly, it's not snapping to the grid, and then by moving it, it's actually moving from that position. So that really is inconvenient. But what you can do is kind of move it nearby, and then that's where the Shift S cursor to grid comes in quite handy. So that's moved it right to this grid that we've got set up here. So if I kind of clicked somewhere near that point there, it's not exactly on it, and I press Shift S cursor to grid, well, it's going to move right on top of that position there. I really don't find that very useful, and I've pretty much never used it. Because again, if I click here, it's already moved, and I try and move it on the grid, and it's offset by that amount. So not very useful, in my opinion. But we can obviously change this to vertex snapping, and then it becomes super useful because now I'm snapping a cursor to my edges of this mesh, my vertices. Sorry. And I can do it with edges and faces, and that's really useful. And in fact, if I do change it to faces, we can start to see that when I'm moving along the surface here, we're still getting the orientation of our view, but we can change it to geometry, and then we're going to start seeing that it's following the axes now. But if I rotated this mesh, then we can see that it's actually rotated to the geometry surface. So even though the cursor looks like it's all the same, we know now that that's probably the Z going from that way, so that's quite useful. If I take advantage of that and I press Shift A, because Shift A, the add menu here, is going to add a mesh in always at that 3D cursor. So I've snapped this to the surface. Actually, let's say I snap it to let's say I snap it to, I don't know, I'm going to add an extra ring loop in here, and I'm going to snap it to the vertex in the center here. So now I've snapped it into the middle of the mesh, and it's following that rotation. If I add I can just add a sphere here, and then we can see how that's working. And I can add let's add a Suzanne, a monkey. And at the minute, that rotation is in the world position. But if I go to add monkey, and it says align, we can say 3D cursor, and now it's facing from the 3D cursor angle, which is that orientation. If that makes sense, we can look at that with a cylinder if that's a little bit easier to understand. This is currently the world alignment, so the centerpiece is spawned on that 3D cursor. But if we change the alignment to 3D cursor, we can see how that rotates to face outwards from this mesh, and that can be quite handy. What we want to test here, I mean, if I'm clicking in random space, it's still going to follow pretty much whatever rotation it last had, I think. Or it's going to pick the screen space rotation, it looks like. But it looks like it picks the screen space by default there. But actually, the way that I showed you that you could snap it like that, that's a bit imprecise, obviously. As in, you're probably going to have a mesh with a lot of vertices, so usually snapping like this is something that I don't do either. And what I would do is I'd have that vertex selected in edit mode, and I would use that Shift S menu to say cursor to selected, and there we go, it's moved right there. I'd tab out, I add my mesh, whether I want that to be rotated to the 3D cursor, scale it down, and now I start modeling and doing whatever I want to do. So that's kind of how that works. There's a few other options here. I generally don't use them, so I'm not going to try and explain them because I'm not quite sure what some of them are. And yeah, oh, I'm not sure what that is. Oh, that's just another setting there. So really, it's just that orientation setting that we're bothered about. And let's see. And then what we're looking at here is also remembering that this is a temporary empty object, technically. So if I do snap this to the corner here, or even if I separate these faces with P, so now I've got a separate object. I use Shift S to snap the cursor to that point, and then I'll use W to set the origin to the 3D cursor. And then now the origin is actually working as a rotation point for that mesh. So I've set that really quickly for the origin point there. But then I want this whole thing to be at a different orientation. So if I put my 3D cursor over here, then I select on this menu up here. We can see there's a cursor option there. And traditionally, well, if it's just set to bounding or median point, then this object's just going to rotate from the middle of those two origin points. But I set it to 3D cursor, and it's going to start rotating from that 3D cursor. So if I wanted a very specific rotation on this, then I would be rotating from the 3D cursor. Maybe I would snap it to the grid in that scenario, and I would just look at rotating it from a good angle. Or I would want to do things like there are specific tools dedicated to this. I mean, the old-fashioned way would be just selecting it, duplicating, and rotating, which actually isn't a good one to preview. Let's preview it with that. I'm going to duplicate and rotate. So that's Shift-D and then pressing R to rotate. And it's rotating from that point. And then you can actually repeat that with Shift-R as well, and it creates a spin. But it's actually a tool that's dedicated to that now. So it's been there for a while. But I think we're going to want to be in edit mode for it. And it's going to use the 3D cursor as that origin point still. So we've got a spin tool here. And we're going to want to be spin duplicate. Which doesn't seem to have worked. Maybe it is working, but there's too many of them, so I'm just going to turn that down. The spin duplicates isn't working as I would have thought it was, so I'm not sure what's going on there. Maybe I'm just not using that tool correctly. Pretty sure it didn't used to work like that. I'll check if it's an error with the latest version of Blender. So either way, that is still the origin point based on the cursor there, and that can be a really good thing to know. So I'll put a comment below if this, for this specific part being a bit funny. I wonder why that's gone weird. So I think that's pretty much everything I can think of to do with this cursor. Obviously, you've got it's a really good way of just moving objects around. If I've got two of these, I can go Shift S, cursor to the object, select this one, Shift S, selection to cursor, and I've got it exactly in that right position for when I want to do things. It's just such a fast way of working. And I think that's the main point of all this, and that's why it's a great thing that exists that you should be using all the time. So I think that's it from me, and I'll see you in the next one.